Hello, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. So for those of you who do not know me, I'm Ivana Nenadic. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom here at the European University Institute in Florence. This is the week 4 of our online school, which we will focus on the problem of disinformation and more broadly or more specifically on the COVID infodemic. Of course, we cannot ignore what happened or what is still happening in the US. So we will, of course, discuss the disinformation in the US elections, as well. And I'm very happy to discuss or to introduce with our today's speaker, Dr. Claire Wardle. Claire, welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, I think we couldn't have better speaker on this topic than you. Claire is leading strategy and research at the First Draft News, which is an organization dedicated to researching and understanding the problem of disinformation or misinformation. And she's also co-founder and the director of the First Draft. She's also a member of the advisory board of the European Digital Media Observatory, of which the CMPF is also a member or is taking part in the project. And in 2017, if I'm not wrong, you have co-authored a report for the Council of Europe on information disorder, which for many of us who are interested in this topic serves as a Bible, basically, clarifying some of the key concepts and some of the key theories in the field. So I stop here now and I give floor to Claire Wardle.
Oh, thank you very much, Eva, for that introduction. And hello to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you. As we were just saying, I'm very sad that we're not here in person having this conversation, but I would not have been able to fly to Italy the week after the US election. So let's just find the silver lining, which, as you can imagine, there has not been very much sleep for the last 9 months. It's been a very, very busy year, but I'm going to focus today on misinformation and COVID, and I have created some slides. It's always nicer to look at pictures when you're talking about misinformation. So let me just bring these up. And please, at the end, we're going to have time for questions, but if as I'm going along, you have questions, please add them into the chat box. If I see them, I'll try and answer as I go. If not, I'll see them at the end when we have a chance to have a longer discussion about these things. So I've titled this talk, What COVID-19 Has Taught Us About Information Disorder. And the quick answer is a lot. If you're going to listen to somebody for half an hour, it's probably nice to know who they are and why they're talking about this subject. So I previously was an academic. I did a PhD in communication at the University of Pennsylvania. And then I moved back to the UK and became a lecturer at Cardiff University in Wales. And I thought I was going to be a professor my whole life. And in 2008, I started to become really interested in user-generated content. What was this stuff that people were emailing and texting to the BBC? Why were they sending this content to the BBC? And how did the BBC know how to verify it? And the BBC asked me to write this report. So I wrote a report with Andy Williams. And I thought that really nobody was going to read it. But it turned out somebody at the BBC did read it and said, well, can you come and help us for 6 months figure out this new thing? There's this new thing called Facebook. There's this new thing called Twitter. And we really don't know how to work with it. And I was like, oh, fine. This will be really interesting as an academic to go and work with a very big newsroom. And then this happened, which I think is incredibly historically significant. It no longer exists on... It was uploaded to TwitPic. TwitPic no longer exists. It makes me very sad. This should be in a museum. But this guy, Janice Crumbs, tweeted this image when that plane landed in the Hudson River, the plane that's now part of the film with Tom Hanks. And this was January 2009. So Twitter was only a year old. And at this time, the head of BBC News Gathering called me and said, you're the Twitter lady, aren't you? Nobody in my newsroom knew how to find this picture. They didn't know how to verify this picture, and they didn't know whether they could use this picture legally or ethically. Can you leave your job at Cardiff University and come and teach us for 6 months, and then you can go back to your job as an academic? Well, that was 11 years ago, and I am still working with newsrooms around the world, trying to figure out this question of how do you know what's true online? And so I do feel very lucky that my incredibly niche research topic in 2008 has now become the topic of much debate globally. And I feel incredibly lucky to now, to be able to co-found and now lead an organization in the US. We are global, but I lead the US wing. And we support newsrooms, but increasingly we work with other organizations. We're currently working with the WHO, we're currently working with UNICEF. So we're now working with a number of organizations that are struggling with this challenge of information disorder. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. But just very quickly, if there's anything about today's lecture that really interests you, we have a specific online course about how to cover coronavirus if you're a journalist, and you can access it at covid.firstdraftnews.org. It's free, and we have it in a number of languages, including Italian. And if you do not have that much time, but you're still interested, we have an SMS course, which every day for 14 days, you get a text message, which gives you some little nuggets of information about information disorder, how to talk to your friends and family who are spreading conspiracies, some basic verification tools. So you can access that at firstdraft.training. But we're constantly trying to find new ways to make training available to many people and organizations. So if you do it and have feedback, I would love to hear from you. Okay, so here's the agenda for the talk. I'm going to open up with an overview of key information disorder concepts. I'm then going to walk you through 10 characteristics of coronavirus misinformation that we have seen over the last few months. I'm then going to talk a little bit about effective techniques for handling misinformation, because it's no longer just a case of, well, can you find it? Can you verify it? How can journalists responsibly report on misinformation in a way that doesn't actually cause more harm? And unfortunately, our brains as humans are very lazy, and we're very bad at figuring out what's true and false, and we're very bad at remembering that. So there's actually best practices for how we should be reporting on misinformation in a way that doesn't embed the rumor in people's brains. So that's what I'm going to talk about, and then we'll end with some Q&A. So to start, here's an overview of key concepts. And this is a Venn diagram that I created with Hossein Darakhshan, who was my co-author for that information disorder report. And we tried to get people to think about the differences between misinformation and disinformation. And we also came up with this third category, malinformation, because what we wanted people to understand is that there are real differences between the different types of harmful content. And that's what we wanted people to think about. So disinformation, which is what everybody talks about now, is false or misleading information deliberately designed to cause harm. And the people sharing it know that it's false and are hoping to cause harm. That might be harm to a person's reputation. It might be harm to a democracy. It might be harm to a business. They are deliberately trying to create harm, and that is disinformation. Well, that's very different to misinformation, which is also false or misleading information, but the people sharing it don't realize it's false, and so they absolutely don't mean to cause any harm. And so this is the bigger problem that we have. There's actually a relatively small number of bad actors that are creating disinformation. They might be trying to create disinformation for financial gain or political gain, or just to see whether they can get away with it, social or psychological reasons. So there's three motivations for why people create disinformation. But those people are actually relatively small in number, and they have very, very small audiences. The only reason we have a problem is when disinformation turns into misinformation and people become weaponized and start sharing false and misleading information, not realizing that it's false or misleading. So that's when my mum shares something on Facebook about the US election. She doesn't realize it's false. I mean, last night, for example, there was a video of a guy on TikTok who said, look, I'm a postal worker, and he held up a ballot and he said, look, when I open up an envelope and somebody's voted for Donald Trump, I just rip it up and I throw it in the garbage. Now, as you can imagine, that went everywhere last night. Well, it turns out he's a comedian on TikTok, and he was doing it deliberately to get lots of views. He found a sample ballot, he filled it in, it was a joke. Now, you could argue that was disinformation. No, that wasn't. This is a tricky one. We'll get to satire in a minute. But in this way, he knew it was false, and he wasn't trying to cause harm, but I would argue that it was a very dangerous thing to do last night. because what that did was it turned into misinformation with lots and lots and lots of people believing that it was true and sharing it with their friends and family. So that's misinformation. And if I'm a policymaker, I have to come up with very different policies for tackling disinformation than the policies I need to do to tackle misinformation. And that's why it's really important that we understand the difference. The third category, which is malinformation, is actually genuine information. It's not false, but it is being spread deliberately to cause harm. So the most, obvious example here would be something like revenge porn. That's genuine imagery, but it's being shared to harm somebody's reputation. Another example might be deliberately leaking hacked information. Now, sometimes you could argue that a whistleblower is doing that and they're doing it for the good of society. That's not malinformation. But you could argue that leaking Hillary Clinton's emails was a form of malinformation. Other people would say, no, we needed to know what was in Hillary Clinton's emails. So this category is harder to define, but it's important to think about the different ways that information gets weaponized, and that this idea that everything is fake is not true. That's a silly sentence to say, but some of you might know that I'm somewhat famous for refusing to use the term F*** news. And that began back in 2017 when I could see politicians right around the world using the term to attack a free and independent press and to attack those people who are investigating them. And that has absolutely happened. Trust in media is down. And when you ask people what is fake news, most people on the street will say BBC, CNN, New York Times. They don't think about fake news as people in their basements creating fabricated news sites, which is the traditional way that term was used. I used to use that term back in 2014 because it described specifically that, people creating fabricated sites that look like professional news sites. But the term has become completely meaningless, and actually it's being used as a weapon against the news media. So I actually think we shouldn't use it, because it's really important that we have a strong and independent press. And so using the language that's used by politicians to undermine the media is a real problem. And the other reason that we shouldn't use it is because most of this content isn't fake. Most of this content is genuine, but used out of context. So I prefer to talk about the weaponization of context. This stuff isn't mostly fake. And also most of this stuff isn't news. Most of this stuff isn't even text. Most of the most damaging content is visually based, whether that's memes, videos, graphics. That's what we have a bigger problem with. So you will hear in this lecture that I just do not use that term at all. And people sometimes say, oh, Claire, you're missing a big audience who really understand that term. And I understand that, but I think it's on us to use terminology like rumors, propaganda, conspiracies, lies, rather than the term F*** news. It doesn't capture the complexity of all of this. And so again, back in 2017, I created this typology, which I called the 7 types of mis and disinformation, which was a way of trying to get people to understand the broad spectrum of problems that we have. And at one end, I said satire or parody. And people said, Claire, you can't include satire. Satire is a form of art. But the problem is bad actors deliberately create content and say it's satire, knowing that it's not, but knowing that A, it won't get fact-checked, because many fact checkers have a policy of not fact checking satire, and B, knowing that it will very quickly spread because people feel okay with forwarding satire, thinking, oh, people know it's satire, but very quickly they don't understand that, and it moves at speed through the ecosystem. And when people are caught, they're like, oh, I was just joking. So we shouldn't dismiss satire as a tactic because it's there. False connection, things like clickbaity headlines. I would argue that is a form of information disorder. Newsrooms have to think about writing headlines that when people get to the news article, it actually delivers what it says it's going to deliver. Misleading content. I'm from the UK. Many of our tabloid newspapers have been peddling terrible, misleading content for years. Again, we have to understand that that's part of the broader ecosystem. But this is the next one. False context is the biggest category that we see, has been for the last 5 years, which is genuine content shared with false contextual information. When people take genuine images, but from 2016, when people take content from Italy and say that it's actually in France, That's what we see the most of, because if I'm a bad actor, why am I going to spend time and money creating a new false rumor? I don't know if it's going to work. It's much more effective to take content that's already out there on the social web and repurpose it, because it's more likely to get traction and people are more likely to believe it. The next bucket is imposter content, when people take logos of news organizations that they already know, or the names of journalists that they already know, because our brains, as I said, are very lazy. So when I'm looking at social media and I'm swiping through very quickly, I'm doom scrolling, I'm looking for heuristics, which are these mental shortcuts that help me make sense of all of this information that I'm trying to consume. And logos or names of things that I already trust means my brain goes, oh, great, I don't need to do any more checking. Amazing, great, let's move on. And that's why imposter content is so powerful, because it uses that heuristic and it weaponizes it. The next one is manipulated content. Again, often you'll have two genuine images spliced together. Why start from scratch when you can edit something? And finally, fabricated content, which is 100% new content that's false. This would be an example, like deep fakes are, 100% false content started from scratch, computerized, automated processes for creating fabricated content. Now, lots of people, this is what they focus on. Oh my God, we've got to be really worried about deep fakes. If I'm a bad actor, why on earth am I going to spend time and resources doing that when I can just go and find an old image from 2016 and recirculate it? So yes, we do have to think about deep fakes. And yes, by 2022 or 2024, we do have to be concerned, because there might be a deep fake that might impact an election. But I have a lot of faith in very, very smart academics who are working very hard in many universities around the world to get ahead of deepfake. So that's not the thing that I'm losing sleep about just now. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about 10 characteristics of coronavirus misinformation that we've seen in the last 8 months now. So before I go anywhere else, some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but this is this concept of the trumpet of amplification that is based on lots of excellent work by other academics and even some PR specialists, because this has been used in public relations in ways that are a little bit ethically dubious. But a lot of this is about trading up the chain, which, as I said earlier, bad actors have very small audiences. So often when we look at these kind of campaigns, they start in places like the anonymous web. So they'll start in places like 4chan or 8chan or Discord. And it's impossible to necessarily track what's going on in these spaces or to know who's behind them. And once these coordinated campaigns start, they might move then into places like Twitter DM groups or WhatsApp groups, places that can't be monitored. But that's when they're starting to talk about, well, at 6 p.m. we should push this hashtag. Here's a Dropbox folder full of memes that you might want to push out into your networks. So that kind of coordination often happens in closed networks. It will then move into conspiracy communities, and that might be on places like YouTube or Reddit, which, great platforms, but there are certainly conspiracy spaces on those platforms that you and I wouldn't spend much time in, but they will start to propagate in these spaces. Places like Gab, we're now hearing this week of places like Parler are becoming more popular. As we're seeing more people being deplatformed from Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, you're seeing them move into more fringe spaces like BitChute is a video hosting platform, a bit like YouTube. So these are spaces that we also need to monitor. And then they will often end up in places like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram and YouTube, but they might be somewhat watered down, or they might be hashtags that have yet to be seen as problematic. And unfortunately, at that point, it's often when journalists find that content, because journalists are not really spending time on 4chan or 8chan or Parler. So they see it on Twitter or TikTok, like last night, and they're like, oh my God. And then they report on what they're seeing. And that reporting is the oxygen that rumor needs. So remember, this is about how do you reach many people. Now, the dream of bad actors is that newsrooms will just publish false information. That's the hope. After every mass shooting in the US, wrong names will be circulated to the media in the hope that the media will publish that wrong name. They are deliberately targeting the media. If the media does its verification right and doesn't publish, the next best thing for these bad actors is a debunk, because in their heads, they think that a debunk that's done badly is just as good, because again, it gives oxygen and legitimacy to something, because our brains are like, what? I think I just heard something on the radio about something. And we're more likely to remember the false aspects of the rumor rather than the fact that it's been debunked. Not always, and I'm going to get into details later, but this is the hope. And the thing that's missing from this trumpet, because I created this trumpet in 2018, and you're all sitting at home screaming at me saying, Claire, where are the politicians? Because unfortunately now we have a huge problem with normally reliable sources, and I would say politicians should be in that camp, particularly in certain countries. I would just say something about Italy. I think you have been aware of this for a little bit longer, is that if you from social media can have politicians retweeting or amplifying the rumors on social media, it's even more difficult for the news media to not cover what the politician has said, even if what the politician is saying is based in conspiracy or rumor. So I just wanted to start, before we go into these 10 characteristics, to understand this ecosystem, because the first characteristic is exactly that. Bad actors want misinformation to move across platforms from closed groups into social media and then into professional media. So here is an example of a kind of an urgent notice that went up in a community saying, don't open up the door. People are doing door-to-door. There is no door-to-door testing, but that rumor is circulating. That got retweeted by a city of Ercahuleni, I think this is in Colorado. And then it got picked up by the police department, and then it got picked up by the news media. When people did an investigation, there was no rumor about door-to-door testing. I mean, there was the whole debunking of something that didn't exist was designed to make people scared. So in this, it's a kind of a difficult one to explain, but what I want to show is that by people being like, oh my goodness, be careful, be careful, be careful, be careful, it became a news story, when actually, when somebody went back and did the analysis, there was no cases of anybody going door to door. There was nothing to this, but the rumor took on a life of itself. So that's what we constantly, particularly those of you who are journalism students, need to be aware of, that people are targeting journalists and hoping that they will report on rumors, even if there's absolutely nothing to the rumor itself. And secondly, you probably have also heard me say this before, but closed messaging apps are increasingly popular for sharing rumors and misinformation because they can't be tracked. And they are actually seen as more trusted networks because you tend to get them from friends and family. So at the beginning of this virus, back in March in New York, I mean, you guys obviously were the end of February, but lots of these kind of rumors, either saying things like, you know, you can stop yourself from getting this if you drink hot lemon, if you gargle it, if you put garlic in the corner of your room, that kind of stuff was circulating on closed messaging apps, which on one level you would say, well, pretty harmless, doesn't matter if people drink more hot lemon. But on the right-hand side, you might be able to see there was more of these with people saying, oh my goodness, people are going to spray the city. That, you know, if you see helicopters, that's what it's not helicopters, it's people spraying chemicals. There are rumors about lockdowns and people sharing videos of tanks. There was a lot of those kind of rumors circulating on SMS and WhatsApp. So that has been a real characteristic of coronavirus. In many countries like India and Brazil and even Spain, WhatsApp has been very popular for a long time. But in other countries like the US, this felt relatively new. As I mentioned earlier, bad actors absolutely understand that visuals and memes and emotion make for compelling vehicles for misinformation. People who believe in quality information are much more likely to turn to text, and text that's very dry and data-driven. And that's why we kind of have this battlefield that's not even. So I work a lot with UNICEF thinking about vaccine misinformation. And I say, listen, if I go onto Facebook and Instagram, I see all of these anti-vax memes that are really emotive. They're all about first-person experiences of vaccines. They're very, very compelling. If I look at what you're putting out, UNICEF, I see that you've got an 87-page PDF with a picture of a needle on the front cover, but that's the only picture. Like we can't keep working in this way when on one hand, the bad actors really understand visuals and emotions, and those of us on the other side are still too focused on text. 4, remember when I said that a lot of this is genuine content used out of context? So this is just one of, I could have given you hundreds of examples here, but this is back in March. Nice weather has brought people out at the March to End COVID-19 in Cleveland today. If you can look at the numbers, 28,000 likes, over 6,000 retweets. Well, surprise, surprise, it was actually from a Cavaliers championship parade from 2016. I mean, it takes nothing to take that image and give it new context, and people share it because this supported the kind of shame narrative that was happening in March about people not taking COVID seriously. And if that was your worldview, then this fits so neatly into your worldview, your brain is incapable of doing the necessary checks because you're like, yep, exactly. That's why these people are stupid. That's why COVID is such a problem, you know, and you immediately get fired up and you reshare it because it's doing what it needs to do. We don't talk enough about financially driven misinformation, but unfortunately with coronavirus, we have seen a lot of scammers using coronavirus to sell false testing kits, cures, and treatments. Here's an example, which is a scam artist, but they've used the official National Health Service logo from the UK. Again, remember what I was saying, imposter content there. I see the NHS logo, I'm much more likely to trust it. 6, lots of rumors have been circulating in local groups and online spaces. People tend to trust local sources of information. So it's very difficult. If you're First Draft, we try and monitor misinformation. It's impossible for us to be in every local group and every local space. Like Nextdoor is a pretty popular app. I'm not sure if it is in Italy, but you can only join it if you live in a particular location, and people share rumors about, well, why is the traffic light down? I've just seen somebody potentially selling something door to door. I'm scared. Like it's that kind of app. But that's a real problem for any of us trying to monitor misinformation, is how much local community groups, particularly on Facebook, have become powerful drivers of this kind of content. 7, misinformation and hate speech are increasingly blurring. People are taking advantage of existing racial divisions and xenophobia. This won't surprise you. It's pretty depressing. And when we think about definitions, and even from a policy perspective, when people say, well, the platform should do more about this, you know, often platforms will have hate speech policies, they might have misinformation policies, but they struggle when these kind of types of content intersect in a way that I just don't think the platforms are really across how damaging this kind of content is. And these kind of things that I'm showing you here, they wouldn't pass any hate speech boundary of the platform's guidelines. So my concern with this kind of content is it's a drip, 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 a daily drip, 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 drip of this type of low-level, xenophobic, divisive content that doesn't break policies, but it's everywhere. And I think if we don't take seriously what this kind of drip, drip, drip of content does in the long term to society, we're in trouble. Like, just look at these, just look at the engagement numbers on these. You know, these aren't random ones. This kind of content was getting a lot of pickup. Keyword squatting. If you're interested in this, there's a great report by Joan Donovan called Source Hacking. And she goes into detail about this concept of keyword squatting, which is, you see on the right-hand side, I'm not sure you can see, it says hashtag CCP virus. This became a hashtag that was very popular, and it basically got corrupted by bad actors using that hashtag to push misinformation and conspiracy content. And the other type of keyword squatting, of course, here was people just buying up domain sites, hoping to get, you know, take advantage of SEO, do whatever they could to get traffic because they knew how many people were searching for these keywords. Oh, where's my 9 gone? 9. So we talked about imposter content. On the left-hand side is an example of a pamphlet was put through people's doors in Los Angeles right at the beginning of the COVID virus. And you can see here, they use the CDC logo, they use the World Health Organization logo. It looks very official, full of rumors, was posted through people's doors. I mean, again, you'd have to really, really be skeptical to believe that this didn't have some sort of official capacity. So it's a very effective vehicle. And even on the right-hand side, Kent Online is a very small local news outlet in the UK. Somebody took the Kent Online logo and created this idea that there was a quarantine zone around a Costa coffee. Not true. 2 Albanian nationals who recently visited. I mean, just an excuse for xenophobia. But again, by using a logo that people locally know, it's more likely that people are going to believe it. And finally, attribution is really hard, and it's often impossible to know who is behind a rumor or conspiracy in real time. And that was the case with a lot of coronavirus content. So do you remember I was saying at the beginning, there are a lot of these kind of WhatsApp rumors about lockdowns. If I played this video, it's basically a man driving down the motorway and he's going past a line of tanks and he's like, oh my goodness, they're coming to the cities because of coronavirus. And at the time, everybody was full of conspiracies about this. There was some research done by the New York Times a few weeks later saying that these SMS messages were being pushed by China. Now, I haven't seen any other reporting other than the US State Department saying that. It's very difficult for us to know who is behind any of this. And so I think when I say this is number 10 as the characteristics of coronavirus misinformation, we still know very little about the actors behind a lot of this kind of misinformation. And we're still in the throes of this, but I think that's one thing that's missing when we think about the characteristics is we have a lot of content, but we don't know very much about the actors who have been pushing that type of content. Okay, I'm now going to move on to effective techniques for handling misinformation. So we've got all of this stuff. What should people do with it? So one thing that I want you to think about is this concept of the tipping point, which is this idea of if you go looking for misinformation, you will always find it. But if you go reporting on that misinformation, you're potentially giving oxygen to something that otherwise very few people would have seen that rumor in the first place. And from our research, if you go to a rumor too quickly and report it, you can give it oxygen. But if you leave it too late, it's very difficult to pull back that rumor. So the example we use all the time is Pizzagate, this conspiracy, this idea that there was sex trafficking happening in the basement of a pizza restaurant in DC. Well, reporters knew about it. They're like, there's no way we're going to report on that. That's crazy. But it turns out there are enough people who believed it that by the time they tried to debunk it, it was too late and a guy turned up with a gun at the pizza restaurant. So this tipping point is very difficult to measure, and it's very different depending on the location, your audience. If you're a small community newspaper in southern Italy, your tipping point is going to look very different to the New York Times tipping point. So there's some of the things that you need to think about. And so when you're measuring the tipping point, if you're a journalist, thinking about these 5 questions. Firstly, how much engagement has the content received? Is it just likes or there are lots of shares? So if a piece of content is getting loads of likes but no shares, I don't care about it. It's only if people are sharing it that I'm really starting to worry because I can see it traveling. Secondly, is the discussion limited to one community online? So for example, if I go into anti-vax communities on Facebook, there's a lot of misinformation there, but it's not really going anywhere else. It's staying in those communities on Facebook. Again, that hasn't passed a tipping point. I'm not going to bother with that. It's fine where it is. And if I report on that, then it's actually going to give more oxygen and legitimacy to that community. Third, has the content jumped platforms? So you might be seeing it on Facebook, but can you see it on Instagram or Twitter or YouTube? Is this actually moving, or is it, again, just in a very niche fringe community on one platform? Fourth, and this is the biggest problem we face, did an influencer or verified account share it? So there has been a number of occasions in the US where we were seeing rumors bubbling along and we're like, no, not worth covering it, not worth covering it. And then Trump would tweet something about it and we were like, oh, now really it's very difficult not to cover it because he's given it huge amounts of oxygen. The other example is the link between 5G and coronavirus. We were seeing that in fringe groups in January, February, March. We kept saying to newsrooms, no, hasn't passed a tipping point, not worth giving it oxygen. And then Woody Harrelson, the actor, tweeted it or shared it on Instagram. And then a boxer in the UK did, another kind of TV personality in the UK did. And all of a sudden it became a thing that newsrooms were like, we've got to cover it now because celebrities have shared it. So that's a real problem in that it's often these influencers that cause something to pass the tipping point. And finally, did the mainstream media share it? Because again, you can be a newsroom that's very, very responsible, but if your competitor is running with it and your audience is starting to believe it, then again, what role can you play in helping to stamp down on that rumor? So I'm just quickly going to talk about 4 psychological theories that help shape our understanding that's based on the Debunking Handbook, which is really a very good piece of work by Stephen Lewandowski and colleagues about best practices for doing this work. But one thing I'd say is we don't have enough research to really know what's happening in these contexts. And for example, how this works for climate misinformation is different to vaccine misinformation, is different to political misinformation. It depends if you're a real believer in a particular topic or you're just interested. It depends on whether you're searching for information versus stumbling across it. So take all of this with a grain of salt to say, these are best practices as we know them now, but there's still so much research that we need to do about them. So the first, familiarity backfire effect, which is this idea that by unnecessarily repeating falsehoods in order to correct them, debunks can sometimes make falsehoods more familiar and thus more likely to be accepted as true. So repetition and familiarity are the two characteristics that our brains really struggle with. So even if you see 3 debunks around the same subject, you're like, I do think I've seen this a lot. I mean, our brains are rubbish. I mean, that's what you really need to understand. So some people say, well, we shouldn't be fact checking. Well, that is not the case. We should be fact checking. We do need a correct record, but we need to be aware of how we write our headlines. It doesn't matter if your 800-word fact check is excellent. If you have a headline that just repeats the rumor, then people are more likely to remember that. So that's what we're thinking about here. It's not about not debunking, it's how to do it responsibly. So avoid repeating a falsehood unnecessarily while correcting it. And where possible, warn readers before repeating falsehoods. So you might have heard of this concept of the truth sandwich. So you could say, the fact is that there was no election fraud, no evidence of election fraud in the US. Rumors are circulating from Republicans that there was voter fraud. However, people are still failing to give evidence of that voter fraud. So you're starting off by saying the facts, you're then giving a warning before you repeat the falsehood, and then you're returning to the facts. That's very hard to do in a 280 character tweet, but I'm giving you an example of the kind of things that you need to think about. And one thing I want to stress is this kind of thing is terrible. Too often you see people say 5 myths about coronavirus on something like this. Never just repeat myths like this, because our brains are much more likely to just remember the myths than the facts. And so sometimes you'll say 5 myths about coronavirus, and it will say myth in capital letters, colon, repeat the myth. Myth, people can't remember that is a myth. So we need to be really careful. This is the other thing that keeps happening. People putting in bold and in larger font the rumor, and then giving the explanation in smaller font. Nope. I keep seeing this everywhere. I saw Lysol, the company, they did a big fancy website, did the same thing. The other day I saw a rumor website from the American government doing the same thing. No. We have to stop giving emphasis to the rumors. We have to lead with facts whenever we can. Second, overkill backfire effect. So the easier information is to process, the more likely it is to be accepted. Less detail can be more effective. So those of us who work in the quality information space, we love text. We love words. We like a lot of words. We need to be much better at thinking visually, because as I said, that's how bad actors are working, because they understand the way our brains work. So we should be making our content easy to process by keeping it simple, short, and easy to read, and where possible, using graphics. So this, to me, should win a Pulitzer Prize, because this was the most effective way of explaining a very complex problem. And people very quickly understood what this meant. What's the equivalent of this on many, many stories that we're reporting? Newsrooms should be hiring more illustrators, more designers. This is really critical. Even things like this, I'm not saying that this is perfect, but people are really confused. What's the difference between social distancing, self-quarantine, isolation? Like something like this, it's more fun, it's more engaging, it's more likely to be shared than an 800-word article. This was also amazing. This woman in New Zealand, Susie Wilkes, she just kept making amazing GIFs and graphics. I was like, who are you? I love you. She just was so great at making complex ideas simple and engaging and visual. And that's really what we need to be thinking about as we learn lessons from this first wave of the coronavirus. And this is the WHO's Mythbusters. They partnered with Pinterest to make these pins. Now, I don't want to be mean about the WHO because we're working with them and I like them very much. But look, there's a lot of text on these. Those of us who are scientists and researchers love text, but you can hardly see this text. Like this is not, when I say visuals, this is not what I mean. So again, we need to be much better at this. Worldview backfire effect. So when people process information in biased ways, people process information in biased ways. So when debunks threaten a person's worldview, those most fixed in their views can double down. And so this is something we really need to think about when we're talking to friends and family who are sharing false information, or even audiences if you're a journalist. And that's about avoiding ridicule or derogatory comments, and by framing debunks in ways that are less threatening to a person's worldview. And this doesn't matter if somebody is from the right or the left. It doesn't matter if they are highly educated or less educated. The information that we all share on social media is tied to our identity, and it's a performance of sorts. The things that we decide to share, we're thinking in our heads, how does this make us look? And we know this from Instagram. Nobody shares pictures of your terrible dinner or a terrible sunset. We share things that make us look good. And similarly, when we share articles, we are using our identity to either say, I supported Donald Trump, or I supported Joe Biden, or I support vaccinations, or I don't support vaccinations, or I believe in climate change, or I don't, but these things are tied to our identity. So when you tell people that they are wrong or that they're sharing false information, you're not just giving them more context, you're attacking their identity. And so when we talk to one another, we have to be much more empathetic and to understand why it is that they might be believing that, and to talk to them in ways that it's about us, it's about community, it's about neighborhood, it's about family, and saying, wow, I saw that you shared that on Facebook. It's really interesting. I've seen a lot of people trying to understand this on my Facebook feed, but I'm a bit worried that there are people who are trying to use information in ways that's really damaging our community. And I would love to talk to you about this, because I actually think this is a real problem. And I just really want to think through how we can understand this problem better. So again, it's much easier to say in a lecture than it is to your crazy uncle. But we have to start holding each other accountable, but not in a way that says, hey, you shared something, by the way, here's a fact check from CNN, like you're wrong. Like that's the worst thing that we could be doing. And so we need to find ways to talk to each other about when people are sharing false information. Missing alternatives. So labeling something as false but not providing an explanation often leaves people with questions. So if a debunker doesn't answer these questions, people will continue to rely on bad information. So if I believe something and then my best friend comes along and says, Claire, you're wrong. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I quite believe, it's my best friend. She's really smart. So a gap opens up in my brain. But if my best friend doesn't give me something to fill that gap, then my brain is more likely to go back to believing the false piece of information. So we need to be better at providing the explanation. And that is often thinking about this. Camille Francois from Graphica talks about the ABCs of disinformation: actors, behaviors, content. And too often we focus on debunking the content, but we don't explain the actors or the behaviors. Because once you start talking to people about the tactics and techniques being used to manipulate them, they're much more likely to be like, oh. Whereas if you say, wow, you really don't believe in vaccines and you're wrong, then somebody's like, well, I tell you what, I am right. And the conversation ends. But if you're like, well, you know what, people are trying to sell you a false cure because they're trying to make money, then you're talking to somebody about the manipulation strategy, not trying to convince them about the content. Because we know this from confirmation bias and all the things I've been talking to you today. It's very difficult to convince somebody when it's tied to their identity. But when you talk to them about manipulation tactics, it's much more effective. So we really should be answering any questions that a debunk might arise. And so this is one of my favorite headlines of all time. Major funder of anti-vaccine movement makes millions selling natural health products. Because here you're giving an explanation of why there might be people trying to push these types of ideas. And that's all happened in a headline. And I think this is a challenge when you've got limited space, but we need to be better at providing an explanation. So the other famous example used in training is, rather than saying Obama is not a Muslim, because you've ended up being like, what? Well, he's got a funny name and people have told me that he's a Muslim. People are more likely to connect those two things. Instead, you should be showing imagery of Obama going to church with Michelle on a Sunday, because you have then replaced that hole in people's minds with an alternative explanation. So again, that's an easy training example. It's sometimes harder to do this in, when you're working on these issues, but it needs to be the focus on facts and providing an explanation of why people might be pushing false information. Like, we don't talk enough about how many people are selling. Like, this is Alex Jones. I think some of you know Alex Jones is a conspiracy theorist. Look at all the supplements he sells. It is ridiculous. So anyway, just best practices. 1, focus on the facts wherever possible. 2, try and make your content easy to process. 3, avoid ridicule or derogatory comments. And 4, answer any questions that a debunk might arise. So that is me. I think I was sort of time-wise not too bad. So I will stop sharing so we can potentially go to some questions.
Thank you so much, Claire. This was amazing. I mean, you have managed to convey so much information in a very clear way to us in such a short period of time, unpacking this very complex phenomena and this very complex problem of misinformation and disinformation. While you were talking, we already received several questions in both in chat and in our Q&A part of the platform. I think Luke is now promoting everyone into participants so that we can have this virtual face-to-face interaction. But in the meantime, maybe you want to address some of these questions. I'll start with the first one, asking what is your view on the filter bubble echo chamber discussion?
Yeah, so as I think the person who's asking the question knows that there's quite a bit of academic debate about this, sort of led by Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen at the Oxford Institute, who's a good friend. Who's like, well, I don't think that Facebook is as bad as the time when we all used to only read one newspaper. And I am sympathetic to that idea. And with all of these concepts, we need more research. And the problem is, because we can't see people's feeds, it's impossible to really know how serious this problem is. But one thing I would say is, we really have to look at the way that recommendation algorithms drive people down a certain path, which is slightly different. But the people I see who, I'm going to use this word, have become radicalized by searching for something on YouTube and then over time being recommended something, like the rabbit hole concept, I do think that's a real concern. Whether or not I now see, I see more content from the left and the right because I use social media, but whether or not I click on that, I think is a different story. So I think we sometimes tell this story of, well, on Facebook, you see a number of different things, but there's a lot of evidence. If you're on the left, you're scrolling through Facebook and there's a story that potentially says that Obama wasn't as good as you thought he was, people on the left don't click on that because they don't want to be told that Obama wasn't perfect. Similarly, on the right, people don't want to hear anything that doesn't support their worldview. So I think when you talk to the platforms and say, well, shouldn't you be serving up different perspectives to different people? They'll say, we've been doing it for years. Of course we want that to happen. But you know what happens when we serve it up? Nobody clicks on it. So unless we really understand as a society that there is a reason to have two sides and there is a reason for us to have a mixed diet, you can't force people to consume content that challenges their worldview. It's exactly what I just gave that lecture on. Information, if you're from the left, you don't want to hear information that challenges that worldview. So the filter bubble echo chambers thing, yes, I understand Rasmus's argument, which is, I think it's a bit more complex. I agree that it's complex, but I also don't go with this argument that it's not a problem, because I see way too much radicalized. Right now, there's two completely different social media worlds. One that believes that the election was stolen, one that believes the election was fine. There's another two worlds, one that thinks that we can't wait for the vaccine to come out and everybody's buying an EasyJet flight. The other side that is never going to take a vaccine and thinks we're all going to be microchipped by Bill Gates. And that is happening. I can see it right now in my tweet decks because I have different lists. That if we don't see that as filter bubbles and echo chambers, then I think we've got a real problem, because the polarization of people's media systems, both in mainstream, Fox versus CNN, right-wing, left-wing social media, it's a huge problem. And I think we're seeing the results of what that leads to. It leads to people not accepting an election result. This is no joke.
As you've already touched upon the confirmation bias, I think there is another interesting question that is on the same page, but targeting also fact checkers, asking about political bias in accepting fact checks. So how can fact checking be effective for correcting the recording groups who do not accept fact checkers themselves as authorities?
Yeah, so some of my best friends are fact checkers, and fact checking is absolutely critical so that we have a correct record. But we've just been doing some research on labels on Facebook and asking people to basically reflect on when they see a label come up on Facebook. It will not surprise you to hear that people on the left love fact-checking labels. People on the right absolutely hate the fact-checking labels, think the fact checkers are idiots, and don't want fact checkers anywhere near their Facebook feed. So we do have a problem that there are large swathes of Facebook users and other types of social media users who don't believe that the fact checkers are independent and unbiased. Now, the International Fact Checking Network has a very strict code of principles. They do amazing work. The problem is when information has been weaponized, as it has been now, those people who are trying to push credible information, who are transparent in their process, who do everything that we would all want them to do, are being undermined because nobody's interested in that, because information has been weaponized and has been used as part of, unfortunately, these culture wars in many countries now. And so this idea that fact checkers could be the independent arbiters of truth, we're being naive. They absolutely have to exist. We have to have a public record. Historians will be so happy that they existed. Are they doing everything we want them to do now? Well, no, they can't. They literally can't, irrespective of how good they are at their jobs, because of the ways that they're being attacked and undermined.
We're receiving so many questions in the chat that I cannot promise to be able to follow up on on everything. But let's go back to one of the first questions as well, coming from Kosovo. I think it's Dren, if I'm not wrong. He said that we had imposter content in 2 last elections in my country, so in Kosovo, using real media, name but another domain. What about shallow fakes or cheap fakes?
Yeah, well, this is all the stuff that we see all the time, which is it's much easier to take a logo of a news outlet, change the domain, because on Facebook, it all looks the same. So if you use a logo of a Kosovo media organization on Facebook, unless I click out to double check the domain, do a search on who.is to see when it was registered, I'm just going to see it on Facebook. It looks the same as that actual Kosovo news organization. So I think I saw somebody in the chat talk about how do we talk about misinformation more generally? And that is what we should be doing more of, rather than waiting for misinformation to circulate and then issuing a debunk after the fact. We should be doing a lot more of pre-bunking, which is we know the kind of rumors that people are going to see around an election or even a pandemic. We should be priming them to say, it is very likely you are going to see these rumors. You are seeing these rumors because it's in certain people's interest to suppress the vote. It's in their interest to suppress the vote because blah, 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 blah. And talk to people about the tactics and techniques of this, because this question about shallow fakes, there's been this massive panic for the last 12 months about deep fakes. And I kept saying, nobody is going to spend the money on a deep fake when you can do an easy enough job in Photoshop. Not even Photoshop, Paint. Microsoft Paint from 1996, you can do this stuff in. So I think that we need to talk to people about how easy it is to do that. So in focus group research, I read there was some amazing comments from people when they were shown photos and said, look, this is from 2016 with a different context. People are like, oh, I had no idea that people did that. Like, there's just a lack of understanding of how easy it is to take old content and give it new context. So we've got to do so much education around the actors who are pushing this stuff, why they're pushing this stuff, how easy it is to push this stuff, and how it's all about the fact that we're not being skeptical enough. That's why we're being weaponized, because we are being seduced by emotional content created on Photoshop.
We also have one very long question, so whoever posed it, please correct me if I skip something very important in it, but I think it's very interesting. It touches upon the tipping point that you have discussed in your presentation, and also declining trust in media. And the question is more or less, when media decide on what kind of, or which misinformation to report about, can this also backfire to them in a way that it will further decrease the trust, the very fragile and low trust that mainstream media have at the moment?
Yeah, well, this is a very difficult line for media to tread, because for a long time, media said, we shouldn't ever have to report on rumors. Like, journalism is about the truth. Journalism isn't about falsehoods. But in the last 3 to 4 years, a lot of research has shown that audiences want newsrooms to help audiences navigate this polluted information environment. But it's difficult to do because, as I just described, if you give too much emphasis to the rumor, you're giving it oxygen in a way that you wouldn't normally. So if you're CNN and you report on a very small rumor about Latinx voters in Miami, and it's actually a small thing, CNN gives it this huge audience that otherwise wouldn't see it, and that's a real problem. But there's a local news network in the US called Tegna, and there was a mass shooting in Texas, I think 2 years ago now, and I saw something that was magical when they did their coverage. They were next to one of those big TV script, like, you know, one of those boards in the studio, and they had 3 columns, and they said, in this column, this is everything we absolutely know to be true. In this column here, this is absolutely everything we know is false. This middle column is what we're working on. And we will let you know as soon as we have been able to identify that. Because when you don't talk about rumors that people see circulating on social media, like, oh, it's a conspiracy and it's a cover up, that's why the news media isn't talking about it. I would argue that in terms of creating better levels of trust with the audience, we need to be better at saying, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and being very careful about what we amplify and what we don't. Because there was a lot of news media that have covered the far right as a kind of like, look at all these rumors and conspiracies in the far right. They did it, they got lots of clicks and traffic, but they gave legitimacy to many, many voices and many rumors and conspiracies that didn't deserve that level of legitimacy and put people in the spotlight that didn't need to be. And the challenge for journalists is this idea that more sunlight is a disinfectant. That is a central paradigm of journalism, which is if you shine sunlight on corruption, then you are going to, make it visible and make it better. But that same concept doesn't work when you're dealing with bad actors and disinformation, because they are hoping that the news media will fall into that trap because they want that sunlight. And that sunlight on their like horrible petri dish of horror makes it grow into something that it shouldn't necessarily have grown into. So it's a really difficult balance. I would argue the news media should do much more on generalized media literacy work and saying to the audience, there's stuff out there that's not true, and we're going to help you navigate that. Help us, tell us what you're seeing, but it needs to be a new form of journalism that many newsrooms are not yet ready for.
In your view, which European countries have better handled communication on COVID crisis or COVID risks and necessary measures, and who did really bad?
So I think you can look at the numbers to decide who did well and did badly. My country, the UK, did terribly, continues to do terribly, has been very, very confused. I mean, I'll have to admit, because I'm currently living in New York, I don't think I know as much about the different countries and what they've done. I think I'm slightly biased towards Angela Merkel because she's a scientist, and I think because of that has understood this. But in terms of government communications, I actually think a lot of governments were not prepared for this. The WHO was not prepared for this. The CDC was not prepared. They have stayed in a space which is, we need to wait until there's consensus to give clear direction. But as we know, misinformation flourishes when there's a vacuum. So when there was uncertainty about masks, when there was uncertainty about airborne transmission, it's actually caused conspiracies and misinformation to flourish and a confused audience. So I would actually say across the board, I mean, I think the best has been New Zealand, South Korea. I don't actually think Europe or the US has done particularly well. I hope there's been a lot of lessons about how do you communicate in a crisis. And right at the back of the beginning of coronavirus, I was on a webinar with a guy called Joe Smizer, and he said, we should have gone into this as crisis communication professionals and thought about this as a wildfire. During a wildfire, you see the fire chief stand in the town square and say, right now, the fire is here. Tomorrow, the fire could be there, there, there. I don't know where the fire is going to go tomorrow. You need to stay with me and I will give you information as I have it. You need to trust me that I will give you that information. But I would argue that governments and journalists didn't think about coronavirus in that way and tried to pretend that they knew everything, and they didn't, because data was still coming in. And that led to real confusion, and confusion therefore led to misinformation.
I would love to let some live voices in instead of me reading all the questions from the chat. So first come, first served. Raise your hands and I'll try to combine this with continuing reading the questions from the chat. While you find your courage to pose the question here.
Has her hand up, actually.
Who has?
Adriana.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Adriana.
Hello, hello, Eva. Thank you, Claire, for this wonderful presentation. I would like to ask you for your opinion on a very interesting case that is happening in Spain. So the Spanish government created a permanent commission against discrimination in an attempt to fight against online fake news and disinformation. The issue is that this commission is composed exclusively of representatives from different ministries. Media outlets, journalists associations are not involved in the process. So this means that the sole authority deciding what actually constitutes fake news is the government. What is your take on this institutional response?
It's a disaster. it's a disaster because, as I have spelled out, we can't dismiss the fact that governments and politicians are sometimes part of the problem. So there is a real need for there to be independence when we think about these things. So when I see governments setting up fact-checking units, I just roll my eyes. It's the worst possible situation. And even in the EU, some of you might have heard of EU versus Disinfo, which does really great work, but it's funded entirely by the EU Parliament, and it is part of a diplomatic effort to make clear that Russia is trying to undermine the EU. So I understand why the EU Parliament is funding this, but it is not where we should be when it comes to tackling disinformation. And I've said this too, I'm part of the EDMO, the EU Commission is trying to support a lot of fact checkers. I struggle with the EU Commission playing such an active role. They should be facilitating an independent entity that truly is funding fact checkers, disinformation experts, researchers. We should have a central pot where money comes from governments, comes from platforms, but it should be independent. It's impossible for us to, I think, take seriously government entities that want to be part of the response. Because as we're seeing in the US right now, the US itself, the current sitting president and his administration is pushing out lies in a really damaging way to democracy. So it can't even be, well, this politician's good, so this government can be part of it, but this government can't. Governments change in democracies, and that is a healthy element. But that means that they can't be part of this tackling of disinformation because it's in politicians' interests to sometimes be part of this problem.
And what about platforms? We have a few questions in the chat, and I'm also very curious about this one because platforms such as Facebook and Twitter have implemented a series of measures in a response to COVID-related misinformation and disinformation, but also in terms of the political campaign you just had recently in the US. So what do you think of these measures? For example, Twitter using this flagging to flag Trump's tweets and things like this?
Yeah, so firstly, I'll answer the COVID question because back in March and April, many of us were like, hang on, we're seeing more from the platforms than we've ever seen. And there was this kind of big celebratory, oh, thank goodness the platforms are now like acting on disinformation. Well, the reason they could act was because they basically hung themselves off the back of the WHO and said, thank goodness the WHO can be the arbiters of truth and we will just surface WHO information and we'll be fine. Because they suddenly were like, well, this is health misinformation. That is different to political disinformation. But by the time we got to the summer, things like masks had been politicized. Whether or not we should be in lockdown had become politicized. So it was no longer, should I gargle lemon water? It was people having fights in supermarkets about wearing a mask. And so we've seen in the last few months, the platforms were like, oh, this is hard. We can't disentangle health and politics. So I think they've learned a really important lesson, which is this is going to continue to be complex. The question about interventions that they've all made in terms of labeling, on one hand, I am pleased that they are doing something. But the second thing, and many of you are academics, it is extraordinarily problematic that none of them are embedding independent researchers to test what these interventions are doing. As I said about that research about labels, some of us on the quality information space, like, oh, labels, that sounds like a good thing. Like our gut says it's a good thing. But when you test it, you suddenly realize it's actually causing more harm with people on the right because it's driving down trust more generally. So for any of these interventions, we need to understand when they label Trump's tweets, does that take them out of circulation or does it make people angrier and send them to Parler? Does it make them angrier and less trustful of quality information? We don't know. And so it's absolutely imperative that we have that independent research. And the other thing is, when we were doing our, we are monitoring this information, my team knows to screenshot everything the second they see it. Twitter, to be honest, were moving very, very quickly last week, much quicker than I've ever seen. But as a researcher, I can't go back and find all the content that was taken down. And I can't see the reasons why it was taken down. Some guy in Silicon Valley, probably a guy, made a decision somewhere every 2 minutes about doing something with tweets. I don't know what that decision-making process was, and that there's no appeals process. So we should be very concerned about the fact that these platforms, yes, they're doing more, but if we don't have a framework by which that there is oversight and transparency, then we should actually be really concerned about what we're seeing in terms of all of these new interventions.
I'd love to let in a few more live questions. Look, do we have someone with a raised hand.
We do indeed. Christian,
Please go ahead.
ask your question.
Hi. I don't know if you can hear me. The connection is pretty bad. I had to run out of the library. Thank you so much for this presentation. I was wondering, a lot of the communication strategies and a lot of the communication tools people have right now are based on either good old-fashioned strategic communication from the military or crisis communication. However, one is pure propaganda. One is very reactive to the specific crisis. I don't know. Is the mask muffling too much?
No, I love that you're wearing a mask.
Okay, good. Thank you. But I was wondering, is there a specific genre that should be seen as disinformation, counter-disinformation strategies? Because misinformation and disinformation, they look the same, but they're not necessarily the same logic. There's intention and there's a strategy behind disinformation. So I was wondering if the response should be modified to.
I love this question because in the last 4 years, there's basically been the growth of, I call it the disinformation industrial complex. Conference after conference, funding situation after funding situation. And I've been in meetings, I'm just going to be honest now, where there's a guy called Chad from the CIA sitting next to a woman called Barbara, who's a librarian. And it's like, well, we're all here because we're all trying to tackle information disorder. It's like, Chad and Barbara should not be in the same room. Because Chad, the way that Chad is thinking about it is very different. And it's exactly to your point, it comes from the defense and military, and it's about it's about kind of state actors trying to fight against one another. And that should be seen as very, very different. So I completely agree with you. And I think we need to, and I've talked a lot about needing ethical boundaries. Like, for example, we don't take money from government. We don't share our analysis with governments because we work with journalists. And so that's our position. Doesn't make it right. But for me, I want to make sure that all of a sudden our analysis isn't being used by government in a way that I would feel very uncomfortable with. So who funds what technology? Who gets given that technology? Should I be sharing keywords with platforms? Well, no, they don't pay me. I mean, there's a lot here about who's doing what and where it should go. So I completely agree with you. The method that I think is completely absent from this is a community-based model. You know, we're currently working with UNICEF around polio misinformation. The people who are absent from these conversations are the public. What kind of information do we want on these platforms? Who can be the disseminator of this? This shouldn't be top-down broadcast from comms and PR agencies. This should be coming from the community themselves, who have been given resilience to tackle this, and they are monitoring and they are securing their own communities. And that's very much about thinking about misinformation. But I would argue that they are nowhere to be seen in these debates. It's this idea, well, if Facebook tweaks its algorithm, if government pushes regulation, we're all going to be okay. Sometimes people talk about media literacy, but it's pretty patronizing. And it's, we just need to teach people how to Google headlines. How do we actually bring the public into this conversation so that they understand the risk, they're part of the response? And it's going to take us 30 years, but that is what I'm not seeing. And that, to your point, is I don't want it to be stratcoms or kind of defense responses to this. I actually want us to think differently. Not about, you know, as you said, disinformation when there are conspiracy theories being pushed by China and the US about the origin of the virus. Yes, that's at that level. That's not for me, that's not my training. And I think we need to be clear about who's trained to do what and what kind of disinformation requires what response. So it's a great question.
I want to add in another question from the chat posed by Claudia about the appropriate responses to people spreading disinformation on the internet. She said that you said that we should be avoiding ridicule, but what do you think about trolling and memes? Do you think that they may be effective or actually counterproductive?
So trolling and memes from bad actors is very, very, very effective. On our
but from
side,
good actors, yeah.
Yeah, for good sides, we should be thinking about humor. We should be thinking about memes. We need to test all of these responses. But as I said, we focus so much on text and we're really boring. And people don't want to engage with our stuff. And so we need to be thinking much more creatively about how do we create highly shareable content. And we should get much better at memes, and we should get much better at humor, and we should get much better at design. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. We need to do it well.
We are 15:50, which means that our time is out. I feel really bad by saying this because I think this has been an amazing discussion. Maybe I'm biased, Also the dogs. I think the dogs agree with me actually, right, Daphne?
Oh God, yes.
They agree with me. Okay, so we should maybe continue the discussion, at least if for no one else then for dogs. I may be biased because I was sharing the session today, but I have to say, to me, this was one of the most inspiring talks we had over the course of this online school for journalists and media practitioners. I don't know if there is another super important pending issue that someone wants to raise and pose for the end. I would still give it a chance, like the last one, and then I will also give a chance maybe to Claire to give us her final message before we close today. Maybe this was too intimidating to ask for the most important question. So Claire, you go ahead. Maybe you want to have a final say, and then I'll also switch to Marie to maybe give some more technical information about the rest of the week and the next week of the summer school.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with everybody. Thanks for the great questions. And I just think the last thing I'd say is this space is moving really quickly. And I worry that we keep responding to what was happening in 2016. And we need to recognize that this space is changing and shifting. And I'll just give apologies that this is a US example, but I think it's important. The first US presidential debate, we watched Joe Biden basically create sound bites in the hope that the news media would amplify his sound bites. President Trump understands that the audience is networked, and what he was doing was creating memeable moments that he knew his audience, which are part of different communities, would take those moments, reshape them, and resend them out to their own communities. He understands that the audience is networked, they are connected, and they work in a way that I would say those of us who come from the quality information space still think in this very broadcast way, this very top-down way. And what President Trump understands is actually the way that the audience is connected and networked. And they have the power to take his content and reshape it to make sense to their communities. That is what we need to get better at, which is understanding the peer-to-peer ways that communication flows through our ecosystem. And so I would say to all of you who care about this, keep watching and recognizing how this is shifting. We are not fighting the battles of 2016, and we have to stay really aware that the problem is getting worse, even though there are more people working on it and thinking about it. And so I do think the next 4 years are going to be critical in terms of hoping that we can get through this, but there's no quick solutions to this. And in fact, there's never solutions, there's just intervention. So it's interesting, exciting, but people need to take this seriously because this is not frivolous. Misinformation is not frivolous. It is causing real harm.